All right, so in the heart of South America's incredibly bloody War of the Triple Alliance, there was this one fortress that stood as a perfect example of the power of geography. We're going to dive into the story of Humaitá, a Paraguayan stronghold that was so tough, it was almost like the earth itself had decided to defend it against the combined armies of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay.
And this really gets to a fundamental question of war, doesn't it? What's more important, the person fighting or the ground they're fighting on? The story of the brutal, years-long siege of Humaitá, well, it gives us a pretty clear and really compelling answer.
So to really wrap our heads around this whole conflict, we first have to understand the fortress of Humaitá itself. For the Allied forces, this wasn't just some military base. It was this incredibly complex geographic puzzle that they absolutely had to solve.
I mean, Humaitá was the absolute linchpin of Paraguay's entire defense. Its spot on the Paraguay River basically made it the front door to the rest of the country. And pretty much everyone at the time considered it, completely impregnable. And they weren't wrong.
You see, nature itself was Humaitá's best defense. It was perched up on this high bluff right above a really sharp horseshoe-shaped bend in the river. That meant its cannons could just hammer any ship that tried to get close. And a land attack? Forget about it. It was surrounded by this maze of swamps and reed beds that created a perfect natural kill zone.
And as if all that wasn't enough, the Paraguayans then dug over 8 miles of trenches. It created this massive fortified perimeter that seemed to stretch on forever, connecting every single one of those natural strongpoints.
Honestly, the best way to think about Humaitá is as this giant geographic lock on the entire nation of Paraguay. As long as the Paraguayans held the key, the fortress was just invincible. It forced the Allies to fight and bleed for every single inch of ground. But every lock has a key.
And for Humaitá, that key turned out to be a small, pretty unassuming bluff just 15 miles to the north called Tayí.
Tayí was the total opposite of Humaitá. While the main fortress was guarded by those impassable swamps, Tayí was the only place you could actually land a boat on the riverbank. It was the crucial link between the river and the main roads inland. It was Humaitá's lifeline and its Achilles heel.
So when the Allies finally captured Tayí, it was a complete game-changer. I mean, it just flipped the entire situation on its head. Before, Humaitá was this powerful base, getting supplies, launching attacks, but after, it wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a cage.
And once the Allies understood how important Tayí was, they moved fast. They threw 6,000 troops and 14 cannons onto that bluff to fortify it. They literally stretched massive chains across the river to block any ships, and in the fight that followed, they sank 2 Paraguayan steamships, totally cutting Humaitá off from the rest of the world.
And this little detail really shows you just how desperate the Paraguayans were getting. In this last-ditch effort, they tried to build a makeshift ironclad ship by just bolting old railway tracks onto a steamship. But the armor was way too heavy, the ship could barely move, and they had to give up. The lock had been turned. Humaitá was officially trapped.
So, trapped and starving, the Paraguayan marshal Francisco Solano Lopez was forced to make a really desperate gamble. He planned this incredibly audacious all-or-nothing surprise raid on the main Allied base camp at Tuyutí.
And we're not talking about a small skirmish here. Lopez threw 8,000 men into this attack. That's a huge force, a big chunk of his remaining army, all staked on one single, desperate roll of the dice.
The plan itself had 3 pretty clear goals. First, and this was the big one, capture enemy artillery, especially those powerful long-range Whitworth cannons that the Paraguayans really wanted. Second, create as much chaos as possible in the Allied headquarters. And third, grab all the loot and supplies they could get their hands on.
But along with those military goals, Lopez gave a fatal order. He told his men they were allowed to loot the camp. And this single command, well, it would snatch a shocking defeat right from the jaws of what was looking like a stunning victory.
At first, the raid was a huge success. The 8,000 Paraguayans caught the Allies completely by surprise while they were still asleep. They overran 2 whole lines of trenches and even set the camp on fire. But then, that order to loot kicked in. Instead of pushing their advantage, the soldiers just scattered, grabbing food, clothes, whatever they could find. All that chaos gave the Allies just enough time to regroup, launch a counterattack, and turn the tables, inflicting what sources call a tremendous loss on the Paraguayans.
The price for that raid was just brutal. Paraguay lost about 2,400 men, either killed or wounded. That's almost a third of their entire attacking force, gone in a single morning. And yeah, the Allies lost a lot too, about 1,900 men. But Paraguay was a much smaller country.
It just couldn't afford a loss on that scale.
But amidst all the chaos of that retreat, this one fascinating little side story happened. The Paraguayans had actually captured their main prize, one of those Whitworth cannons, but it got hopelessly stuck in the mud. So, refusing to leave it behind, General Burgues led this incredibly daring rescue mission under heavy fire, using 12 teams of oxen to drag the cannon back to safety. And once they fixed it, they turned it on the Allied fleet, and its powerful shots actually forced the ships to fall back. It was a small win for sure, but a significant one in the middle of a huge defeat.
But the story of Humaitá isn't just about strategy and cannons. You know, beyond the battlefield, this war had a terrible and often hidden cost for prisoners of war and for civilians.
How prisoners of war were treated is a pretty grim reflection of just how brutal this war was. If you were a high-ranking officer, you were treated with some respect, housed, fed, in exchange for information. But for the regular soldier, getting captured often meant a slow death from starvation and exposure in some makeshift prison, always with the threat of execution hanging over your head.
And the suffering wasn't just for the soldiers. To make sure the Allies couldn't get any resources, Lopez ordered a scorched earth policy. He forced the entire civilian population to abandon their homes and march north. They were only allowed to take what they could carry on their heads, leaving everything else behind. Most of these people, they died on the road, from starvation and misery.
So the story of Humaitá really forces us to ask a difficult question. Sure, the Paraguayans captured a cannon and got a brief taste of victory, but the price was a third of their army and the lives of countless civilians. In the brutal math of war, can you really call something that costly a victory at all?